pointing out here and there a few technical questions. So let me recall, I will write below this dark line. So what we did was, first we introduced the notion of countably infinite sets. Okay, that was the first interesting infinite set. That is, we said that A is countably infinite if it is equivalent to n. Okay, which is the same thing as saying that is if there exists a function from n to a which is 1, 1 and on 2. That is what is meant by equivalence, okay, which I will also keep looking at as follows. That is, if we can write all the elements of A as an infinite sequence, these are all some loose words, all mean the same. What this onto means, F1, F2, F3, if we take, it covers the whole set A because it is onto. So F1, F2, F3, etc. So therefore, this countable infinity, a set being countably infinite, I will use sometimes this idea, sometimes this idea, sometimes this idea. Okay. So that's the first interesting, important notion of infinity that we introduced. And we saw some examples. Obviously, the odd integers and the positive rational numbers, etc., we saw were countably infinite. We'll come across many such sets as we go along. Okay. Then we ask the question, are there uncountably infinite sets? What does that question mean? I want an infinite set which is not countably infinite, that means it is not equivalent to n. So that is, does there exists a set A such that, let me say an infinite set A such that n is not equivalent to A? Because if n is equivalent to A, it is called countably infinite. So if I want it to be uncountably infinite, I want it to be not equivalent to A. Okay. So what does that mean? I must be able to get a set A such that there is no 1, 1 onto map from n to I. So to answer this question, we started looking at some properties of infinite sets. And the first thing we observed was that every infinite set must have a countably infinite subset. That's the first property. So every infinite set has a countably infinite subset. And we use this to show that every infinite set must be equivalent to a proper subset. So we use this and got the conclusion that every infinite set must be equivalent to one of its proper subsets. I am not saying it is equivalent to all its subsets. There is some subset which is a proper subset such that it has the same size as the original set. This is a typical property of infinite sets. Okay. Next we are going to look at the power set, which plays a very important role. So if you are given a set A, then the power set, for reasons that will become obvious later, the powers 2 to the A, power set 2 to the A is defined as the set of all subsets of A. And we all know that if A is a finite set and has n elements, the cardinality of A is n, the size of A is n, then there are 2 to the n subsets, so the cardinality of 2 to the power of A is 2 to the n. Okay. If you have 3 elements in a set A, you can form 8 subsets, 2 to the power of 3, 8 subsets. Okay. So what we see here is, hence we see that if A is a finite set, then the cardinality of A is strictly less than the cardinality of 2 to the power of A. Because if this is n, that will all be growing exponentially, 2 to the power of n. The size of the power set grows exponentially as n increases. Now what we shall now see is that this is true even for infinite sets. The cardinality of A will be always smaller than the cardinality of 2 to the A. So we shall show this is true even if A is infinite. So the proposition that we have therefore is mod A, the cardinality of A is less than the cardinality of 2 to the A for any set A. Now I am no longer putting finite, it could be infinite also. Strictly less than, okay, it's not equal to the cardinality, strictly less than this. Now whenever we say in the case of cardinalities, we are talking about general, it could be finite or infinite. When we say strictly less than, what do we mean? I can pack the set A in the set this one, but I can't pack that set into this one. This box contains elements contained in this box can be put in that, but the elements in that box cannot be put into that. This is the intuitive picture that we will have, which means I can take this and map it to a subset of this, but I can never get a one-to-one onto map from these two. So let me make that. So to prove this, we have to show the following two facts. Cool. What are these two facts? The first one is, there exists a subset K of 2 to the A such that A is equivalent to K. If we have this only, then I can say the size of A is not bigger than the size of 2 to the A. I will get only less than or equal to. I can pack everything in A into some place in B. So I can, if I have this, I will have only less than or equal to. So to rule out that equal to, I have to show they are not equivalent. to show that they, okay, let me even put that. So, and 2a is not equivalent to 2 to the a. This will say less than or equal to, this will rule out the equal to part, and therefore I will get strictly less than. So these are the two things I have to show in order to show that the mod A is less than mod 2 to the a. Now the first one is obvious because take all the singleton subsets and map A to the set A. Okay, so let me quickly do this. So 1. Let K be the set of all singleton subsets as A varies over A. Okay, singleton subsets are subsets of A. So these are all elements in 2 to the A. So the collection is a subset of 2 to the A. So this is a collection. This is a subset of, but strictly containing 2 to the A. Okay. Then you can get a map F from A to K as A gets mapped to the singleton set A. This is 1 1 on 2. Therefore, A is equivalent to K. So that says A is equivalent to a part of 2 to the A. So A can be at most of the size of 2 to the A. Now to prove 2, I have to show that there is no 1 1 on 2 map from A to 2 to the power of A. So what I will do is, suppose there is 1 and get a contradiction. So suppose, so we want to show that there exists no 1 1 on 2 function from A to 2 to the A. So suppose there exists one on 2. Suppose there exists. We want to get at a contradiction. Okay. So we'll show we'll arrive at a contradiction. Now what we will show is, we will produce a subset of 2 to the A, that is an element of 2 to the A, a subset of A, which is an element of 2 to the A, such that it is not f of A for any A. That means the function will not be onto, and which is a contradiction to the fact that we have got. So we will produce an X belonging to 2 to the A such that X is not equal to f of A for any A belonging to A, and therefore f is not onto. A contradiction, because we started with f is 1 1 and onto. Now the production of the set is somewhat similar to the Barber's paradox. And we have seen this before also in the first class itself. So we define the set X as follows. So X, let X be defined as, it must be a subset of A. X must be an element of 2 to the A. Elements of 2 to the A are subsets of A. So I am going to produce a subset of A now. So I am going to look at all those A's such that, now if I take an element of A, f of A is here. That means f of A is a subset of A. Now we look at whether A belongs to that subset or not. So I am going to look at all those elements A who do not go and sit in the image under this map. And there cannot be any such X. Suppose since f is on 2, there exists Okay, x belongs to 2 to the a, and since f is on 2, there exists an x in a such that fx is equal to x, right? Because it is on 2. Now the x is a dilemma, okay? Okay, let me call this as, okay. Now the question is, where is this x? Now this is where the set theory axiom should be very carefully studied. Given any element, it has only two choices. It has to be in that set or it is outside that set, okay. So there are only two choices for x, namely this little x may be in this capital X or it should be outside x. So the two possibilities are x belongs to x, x does not belong to x. These are the only two possibilities. And if I show that both lead to contradiction, I am done. Now if x belongs to x, it means x belongs to fx, because but the moment x belongs to fx, he fails to qualify to be in x. So it says x is not in x. So x is in x, x is not in x, so that's a contradiction. The other way around, if x is not in x, it says x does not belong to fx, so x qualifies to be in x, again a contradiction, x not in x, x is in x. So that's the paradox. It's like the barber, whether he should shave himself or not shave himself. Okay, so what therefore our proposition, so conclusion therefore is, the proposition is true, we have the cardinality of A is less than the cardinality of 2 to the A for every set A. Okay, so now this opens up a big Pandora's box in the theory of infinities, and that Pandora's box is only a smaller one. There is that once you open that, you start seeing a bigger Pandora's box, and bigger, and you get lost in the theory of infinities. Okay, so let's see how it goes. Okay, and we don't even know for sure whether there are some more Pandora's box in between. Okay, boxes in between, to be sure, to be precise. So what is it that we are aiming at? So let us look at now, take A to be the set of all natural numbers. So A is countably infinite. Now this says 2 to the A is definitely infinite set, but n is less than 2 to the n by this proposition. Therefore, this 2 to the n, the power set of n has a bigger size than n, and therefore it's an infinite set which is not equivalent to n, and therefore uncountably infinite. So therefore 2 to the n is an infinite set not equivalent to n, therefore 2 to the n is uncountably infinite. So the question that we asked at the beginning, are there infinite sets which are uncountably infinity? Yes, there are. There are. In fact, starting from any countably infinite set, you can always construct an uncountably infinite set by taking the power set. Okay. Now, let's call S0 as n and S1 as 2 to the n. And now do recursively. We'll define Sn to be 2 to the power of Sn minus 1, the power set of Sn minus 1. Now we get a hierarchy of infinities. S0 size is smaller than the S1 size, smaller than the S2 size, smaller than the S3 size. So we get a hierarchy of infinities, infinite cardinals, like the S0, the size of S0 is less than the size of S1, less than the size of S2, and it goes on and on and on. So the world of infinity, it is not that there is only one infinity. There are several infinities. We don't even know all of them yet. Okay. Let me make certain general comments, questions later, shortly. So therefore, we have a whole hierarchy of infinities. Now the fun starts. Okay. Now, for example, I'm not going to go through all this. That's what I said. This is something which you read all through your life and enjoy. Slowly, things start dawning on you. Don't get into abstraction theory straight away, unless you are a computer scientist, okay, theoretical computer scientist. Then God save you. Okay. Now, for example, I have all these sets, S0, S1, S2, S3, S4, S5, etc., etc. Now, I put all of them together, I look at all the Sns and look at their unions. S0 is a set, S1 is a set, S2 is a set, S3 is a set. Put them all together in a bigger box. Okay? And that set I will call it as sigma naught. And sigma naught is such that the size of Sn is less than this for every n. Strictly less. So in other words, there is a whole world of finite numbers, at the end of which we have this one infinite number, then a series of infinities, then again one more bigger infinity, then a series of infinities starts. So for example, then I will define sigma 1 to be 2 to the power of sigma naught, and then sigma n to be 2 to the power of sigma n minus 1. Then it goes on and on. Put all the sigmas together. Okay. So now you can write any number of papers, you see. So that's, but unfortunately Cantor finished all this nonsense much earlier, before the paper publishing craze came. Okay. And unfortunately he was thought to be a madman, that he is talking about all this nonsense. How can there be so many infinities? Infinity is infinity. Okay, and of course there is something more than this, ordinal numbers and all these things. Okay, now we have been a bit cheating here, not cheating really. The question therefore is, this is, okay, I will make one remark. Look at the two properties of infinite sets that we made. One was that every infinite set has a countably infinite subset, and therefore infinite sets must be at least as big as, or if not, or the countably infinite set. Since every infinite set has a countably infinite subset, every infinite set is at least as big as n. So therefore this is the smallest infinity we can think of. This is not. The countable infinity is the smallest infinity we can think of. Subsequently everything starts. Okay. Now there is a fundamental, gave me this infinity, I recursively constructed several infinities. But is there a possibility there is some other infinity squeezes in between these two? So does there exist a set A such that the cardinality of A is strictly greater than the cardinality of N, but strictly smaller than the cardinality of 2 to the N. Is it possible? Okay, if that is so, then between these two we can put in another series. That fellow, his power set, his power set, his power set, and so on. Then the whole world, then we'll ask, is there anybody else in between, anybody else in between, and so on and so forth. So there is a big problem here. Okay. So this question had to wait for a proper answer till set theory was put into proper axiomatic format. See, there were in the initial stages of set theory, there were lots of paradoxes that were coming into the picture because the formalism was not perfect. So the first and I think the most accepted axiomatic setup is what is known as, I am not very sure about my spellings, Zermelo-Fraenkel. It's a Frankel or Fraenkel. So usually they write it as ZF to avoid spelling problems. Okay. So it's called ZF system. They gave, just like in geometry, Euclid gave the axioms for Euclidean geometry, they gave a set of axioms on which set theory has to be founded. Okay. So that's the most accepted. I will not get into the formalism and all these things, but even there were certain serious problems, and so I will come to this part later. There is something called the axiom of choice, about which I mentioned in the last class. I will do a little bit more about it later. So they felt that this has to be added, and then it became ZFC, the Zermelo-Fraenkel system with the axiom of choice. Then way back, Cantor made a comment, it's called the Cantor's hypothesis. He said no, there cannot exist any infinity between this and that. After this you will get only this. That is called the Cantor's hypothesis. So the Cantor's continuum hypothesis, I will call it as CH. It is called the continuum hypothesis. It says there exists no such set. After this, the next infinity you will get only this. There is no other infinity in between. Okay, that's the Cantor's argument, or Cantor's hypothesis. So because he was not able to prove, so he put it as a hypothesis. And then even with the ZF, it was not possible to prove this. Then they put the ZFC. Okay. Zermelo-Fraenkel plus axiom of choice, the choice hypothesis. Then somewhere around 1938, I guess, I am not very sure about the date. I know it was before I was born. Okay. So you know that I was born after 1938. And otherwise I would have proved it. That's one problem. Okay. The famous man Kurt Gödel showed that if you look at this system, the Zermelo-Fraenkel continuum, the choice axiomatic system, and if you add the continuum hypothesis, it is a consistent system. What does it mean? It does not violate any of these axioms that you have. It does not, it doesn't mean I have proved continuum hypothesis. What I have said, what he showed was that it does not violate the other axioms. It is like the parallel axiom in the Euclidean geometry. It does not violate the other axioms, so it's a good axiom. Okay. But also Gödel is very famous for his incompleteness theorem. Okay, I know very little about it. Okay, I think there are very few people who know little about it. Okay, and probably half a dozen fellows who know about it. Okay. Really. Okay. Now, intuitively, it is like this. If you have a nice axiom, consistent axiomatic system, the word consistent is loaded there. Okay. There are certain things that he puts there. But let us assume that there is a system of axioms, one doesn't contradict the other. Okay. They are perfectly consistent. All of them are valid if one does not violate the other and things like that. If I have a consistent system of a consistent axiomatic system, then I will make a statement which are called undecidable elements of the system. I will make a statement which you can neither prove nor disprove. So all the courts will be in trouble. Okay. So what that is called Gödel's incompleteness theorem. In fact, the Turing also came into the decidability question because it is one of the fundamental problems which Hilbert mentioned in his 23 problems at the beginning of the 20th century. Famous lecture. It's called the Entscheidung problem or something. Decidability problem. Okay. Anyway, the thing is Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Okay. In every, this is not the theorem. If you write probably this statement in a course in a set theory, the fellow will give 0 marks. But anyway, and that's what in it, the basic idea is this. All the notations are later. Okay. In every consistent, probably must make a little more statement about this consistent. In every consistent axiomatic system, there are statements called undecidables. Because we can't decide the truth of them or untruth of them, which can neither be proved nor disproved. Okay. The closest is there is a story in our mythology. I think it is Nachiketa who asked Yama, what is death? Then basically Yama says, as long as you are living in that system, alive, you will not understand what death is. Okay, something like, so sitting in that system, you will not be able to decide truth or untruth of that. You will have to go out of the system. Then once you go out of the system, make a bigger system, then there is another fellow creating problem for you. So basically, there is nothing like you will ever find the absolute truth, or there must be totally different from set theory. Okay, it cannot be axiomatic or something like that. Okay. Okay, therefore probably most of the religions or philosophers, they want to say there exists God, don't question, that's axiom. Okay. I don't ask me to prove it, that's an axiom. If you don't accept it, then you don't come here. Okay. So in every, so what was believed? Okay, so it was believed that if you take the Zermelo-Fraenkel choice system in ZFC, CH is undecidable. Okay. That is, if you had the perfect Zermelo axiomatic system, including the axiom of choice, in that system you will not be able to prove or disprove the continuum hypothesis. It is like you cannot prove the parallel axiom using the other axioms of Euclidean geometry. That's why non-Euclidean geometries come. I can replace the parallel axiom by non-parallel axioms also. So it was believed, but nobody was able to prove that this probably is undecidable. And I think around 1960s, if I remember correct, Paul Cohen proved this. What does it mean he proved that? He showed that you can take Zermelo, Frankel, choice plus the CH, continuum hypothesis, to be true, that is consistent, and not true is also consistent. Okay. So we can have set theory in which continuum hypothesis set theory, non-continuum hypothesis set theory, like parallel Euclidean geometry and non-Euclidean geometry. In Euclidean geometry, the parallel postulate is true. In non-Euclidean geometry, the parallel postulate is false. So you can have set theory in which continuum hypothesis holds. You can have set theory in which continuum hypothesis does not hold. It's more convenient to have a continuum hypothesis, and therefore most people work, almost the whole world works with this. Probably if one works in this, anything you prove is a result, because nobody else is working, and you may find very difficult to publish it somewhere, and you may be very lonely. You may not be able to attend any conference. But probably that's where the challenge is. What does it lead to? There are some people who still hang around with this. Okay. So therefore, we will assume the continuum hypothesis is true. Okay. So we'll be working with the Zermelo, Frankel axiom of choice and continuum hypothesis, all to be valid. Without that, the classical analysis doesn't move, and there is no other analysis. Okay, the non-continuum hypothesis analysis, I think there is very little progress. And if we remove the axiom of choice, there is very little choice to study. Okay, so that's the problem. Now, these were, I think, the work of Gödel was probably something which everybody should read, at least sometimes, several times. Whoever talks about it, try to hear and see whether you understand something from it, so on. Because it's sort of a crossroads in mathematics. Because when Hilbert gave his lectures in 1900, he stated these 23 problems, and one of his great, he was a great proponent that everything can be axiomatized. And Gödel completely destroyed his dream. Whatever axiom you do, you will not be able to prove everything. So everything cannot be axiomatized. There is something beyond the axiomatic world. Okay, I put in simple common sense words. There is a limit to what you can learn, but that limit is endless. Okay. But beyond all that endless limit, there is more. Okay. So we can come back and put something in between, and then the non-continuum hypothesis, then there is a limit, endless limit. And between these two, we put one more second level continuum hypothesis, and so on and so forth. Then there will be endless things going on. But it will be interesting, maybe this century is the one where they take these challenges. Okay. Who knows? Okay, so for us, continuum hypothesis is the is God given. Okay, don't question it. If it's not there, then we can't proceed at all. Okay, the whole real analysis particularly stops. Okay, now I'll give you some standard examples of uncountable sets, because this will be, it's not really standard in the sense, but some things that I am sort of leading to several discussions. Okay, several other things, probably things we are familiar with. Okay, most of it will be intuitive. Some of the proofs there will be slight technical hitch which we'll have to settle, but we will gloss over it, just go through the intuitive ideas. Okay, so let me denote by, from now on, by B this set 0 1, the binary. So B standing in this department, 0 1 I should use always. Okay, then I will use the symbol B to be all, to the set of all possible infinite binary sequences. 0 1 1 0 0. So this is an infinite sequence. Every term is either a 0 or a 1. So this is the collection of all infinite binary sequences. So let me write this. It is the collection of all A, which is A1, A2, AN, etc., etc. An infinite sequence where all the AJs are in B. They're either zeros or ones. So take all possible binary sequences. This is an uncountable set. P is uncountably infinite. So Cantor had a very clever way of showing this. Okay. The way, but we will be using this idea of Cantor in several places in different, slightly varied versions, and several proofs of several theorems in analysis. Okay. The idea is the following: is that suppose it is countably infinite. Okay, I'll get a contradiction. Okay. Suppose P is countably infinite. Now remember, when I defined in the beginning of the class countably infinite, I said I'll view it in different formats. Okay, it's equivalent to M, there exists a 1 1 onto map. The members can be arranged in the form of a sequence and so on. So that's what I'm going to use. If B is countably infinite, the elements of B can all be organized as a sequence. So B can be, this implies B can be arranged as a sequence A1, A2, AN, etc. How do I arrange this sequence? Because it is countably infinite, there is a mapping from N to B. F1 is called A1, F2 is called A2, F3 is called A3, and so on, and this will exhaust because it is onto. Okay, and nothing will be repeated because it is 1 1. Therefore 1 1 and onto says all the elements have been now listed. How does each element look like? Each element is in B. B consists of binary sequences. So I can write A1 as a binary sequence, A1 1, A1 2, A1 3, etc. Similarly A2 as A2 1, A2 2, A2 3, etc. What do you get? You get basically an infinite matrix. Okay, so where Aij's all are 0 or 1. So I shouldn't write Aij, I have put superscript, so I will not put superscript. Now what Cantor did was, well, I will stun you by producing an element in capital B, which is not here. You are telling everything you have listed. From your list itself, I will produce one fellow who is not in your list. Okay. The idea is called this famous Cantor diagonalization. He said, I will write a binary sequence. Which binary sequence? His first fellow will be different from this. Second fellow will be the complement of this diagonal. The third fellow will be complement of the third diagonal. So let X be B1, B2, B3, Bn, etc., where Bj is AJJ negation. If that is 0, this is 1. If that is 1, this is 0. So simply take the diagonals here and flip them. Wherever there is a 0, you put a 1. Wherever there is a 1, you put a 0. You get a binary sequence. And that certainly is not in this listing. Why it is not in this listing? Because it differs from everybody. Okay. And clearly, this is one dangerous word which I use often. Clearly. Okay. Clearly, X is not equal to AJ for any j. Therefore, X is in B, but not in this list. That's a contradiction, because we said the B can be arranged, all the elements in the B can be arranged, but one is missing. However way you arrange, you will find one that is missing, and therefore it has to be uncountably infinite. This is the first one you produced to show that there are see specifically uncountably infinite sets. There is one more example that I will give you, which is essentially this. Okay, and it's cleverly used that after all, what's so big about 0 and 1? Okay, so what he did was, let us take this example too, which is essentially this example. Okay, take the interval, the real numbers, which are not at defined, but we all assume real numbers between 0 and 1. All the real numbers between 0 and 1. Now they all have a decimal expansion. Any real number between 0 and 1 can be written as a decimal expansion. You'll have some confusion about whether to write 0.1 as 0.1000 or 0.099999, etc. So you'll have to follow some convention, say that I will choose only one of these, and so on and so forth. Okay, I will gloss over that a little bit. Okay, so every real number has a decimal expansion. Okay, now I am going to look at only those numbers for which the decimal expansion involves 3 or 7. No other thing appears in the decimal expansion. It may be 0.37, 337, 3337, 337 like that. No 9, 1, 2, 3, etc. appear. So what has happened is, instead of 0, 1, you could have chosen any two symbols. Okay, abstract. I am choosing 37. Okay. Then let me call it a D37. Be the set of all those numbers for which the decimal expansion involves only 3 and 7. I'll later connect it to some set called the Cantor set, such construction, a very famous set called the Cantor set, which is probably one of the greatest sources of all counterexamples, many counterexamples and examples in analysis. I'll connect it to you later. But right now let's look at this set, which is what do you think of this set? Is it countable or uncountable? It's basically this set. This is binary expansion, that is decimal expansion. So I can map this to that. How? Change the 0 to 3, 1 to 7, and reverse way, change 3 to 0 and 1 to 7. So these two are essentially same. Therefore, my friend clearly says, D37 is equivalent to B, and therefore D37 is uncountably infinite. Okay. These are the only two right now I'm going to give, then we'll come back later and see a number of examples. See, in most of the analysis that we will do, whether certain sets associated with the function, whether they are countably infinite or uncountably infinity, have a lot of things to say about the behavior of that function. Okay, so we have to clearly understand what countably infinite and uncountably infinite means. Okay, so I'm going to do a few stray things here and there, okay, about these cardinal numbers. Everything is suggested by what we know, and we try to put it in the right language, okay. Suppose I have to forget about we ever heard about cardinal numbers. The only numbers we know are these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 9. We know how to add them. Right? We have 4 and 5, I get 9. See, it's a very interesting thing. You must remember. I used to have a school teacher who's probably, I will never forget. I mean, he was one of the greatest teachers I had. Whenever we wrote an exam, in which the question was some 4 pounds of, in nowadays it was pounds of rice cost this much, and 1 pound of rice cost this much, 6 pounds, 1 pound of sugar cost this much, one fellow bought 6 pounds of rice and 4 pounds of sugar, how much it costs? Okay. Then in the end you put on something, you put 42. But you must make sure that you write rupees. If you don't write rupees, you will write 42 donkeys and then say it's wrong. So you have to put your unit there. So for example, I can't add 4 apples and 5 monkeys, but I can add 4 and 5. And that's at an abstract level. But once you come to a concrete level, you are in trouble. Okay, so you always have to pull it up to abstract level. So you have to do this transition from concrete to abstract very, very cleverly and conveniently. Okay. So I know how to add these numbers, 4, 5, 7, 8 and all that. How do I add these huge infinite fellows? Now I said there are many infinities. How am I going to add all these infinities? Can I add, for example, the size of n with the size of 2 to the n? So what is going to come? Can you multiply the size of n with the size of 2 to the n? What am I going to get? And can I take 4 to the power of 3? Can I take the size of n to the power of the size of 2 to the n? What am I going to get? So in other words, what is the arithmetic of the cardinals? How does one set up the arithmetic of the cardinals? This is important also, okay? Some of these things will be very, very useful in the theorems that we prove. Okay. So I will simply basically very quickly say what is meant by the arithmetic of cardinals. So whenever I say some x is a cardinal number, I immediately say there is a concrete version of it. What is the concrete version? There must be a set whose size is that x. Okay, that's how we have to always deal with that. Okay, so whenever you have two sets So suppose x and y are two cardinals, two cardinalities. Okay. This means there exists a set A and a set B such that this x is the size, representation of the size of A, and this y is the representation of the size, and any other equivalent fellow will have the same size. So now how do I define x plus y? How do I define x times y? How do I define x to the power of y? Okay. Now the first two are fairly easy in the sense that it's not that difficult to see what's going on. The third one is a little tricky. Okay. So what we will do is the following. First we will see what do we do with our ordinary numbers and see whether that idea can be pulled up. Okay. So suppose m and n are two finite cardinals. Now I know how to add m and n, so I know how the definition of m plus n. Okay, some or the other we know. We don't even know how we got it. Okay. We are somehow drilled and drilled and drilled in that first standard and second standard. 2 plus 3 is 5, 3 plus 2 is 5, 2 plus 5 is 7, 5 plus 2 is 7, and all this. So we know, but really we don't know. Okay. Now, but if this doesn't give a clue of what we have to go doing there. Okay. So now we have to therefore convert it into set theoretic language in order to go there. So I want to convert this m to a set A such that the size of A is m, and we'll convert that n to a set B. I'll look at a set B whose size is n. Then can I construct a set for whose size is m plus n? Can I construct a set, given a set with size m and a set with size n, can I construct a set with size m plus n? If I do that, then I have got an idea how to do that. Take this set A, take this set B, construct the set which gives you the size plus b. Define it to be there. So how do I construct a set whose size is m plus n? Union. Will the union work? The A and B has to be disjoint. But suppose I was foolish enough and I did not choose A and B to be disjoint. So I know there is a set A whose size is m. I know there is a set B whose size is n. But I don't know whether there is a two disjoint sets A and B whose size is m and whose size is n. Suppose I give you, doesn't matter, I give you a set A with m size, I give you a set B with size n. Somehow or the other from that construct a set now x with size m, y with size n, so that x and y are disjoint. Whatever two sets you give, one of size m and the other of size n, is irrelevant. From that I will construct two more sets which are disjoint but have size m and n. How do you do that? Let's see whether some suggestion comes. See, I have A. What is the question? I don't know whether, okay, I have this. I don't know whether A and B are disjoint or not. I want x, y disjoint such that the size of x is m, the size of y is m. How do you do that? Huh? Add the max element. I don't know what is max. They are very abstract fellows. what do you say? What was your idea? X is equal to A. What will you get? Y will be again B. Will that be working? Will they be disjoint? Are you sure? I am not answering the question. Does it work? See, so much doubt. Does it work or not? Exercise, check whether it works or not. Exercise, does it work? Suppose A was B. I didn't say that at all. I said only size. I am talking about size. I am not talking about the elements. See, for example, if A, by mistake I had chosen A, M was equal to N, and I had chosen A equal to B, what would happen? Y would become empty set, and I would get, instead of getting 2N, I will get only N. Do you guys see my objection? I don't even know what the set A and B are. All I know is that the set sizes are M and N. I don't even know what they contain. But somehow or the other, construct two sets X and Y, they are disjoint and sizes are the same. You do all such combinations, then the size will be too big. Did you get what he said? See? Yeah? Good. So, if we didn't get, go and bother him. Okay. Essentially, what you say is, basically what you do is the following. Okay. Don't disturb A, take it as X, and then how I construct is, take a single element of A, okay, and form the ordered pair with that as the first element, but with each B in B. Okay. Now, what is the size of Y? It is the same as B, because the A0 is fixed, only B varies. Okay. Now, is there any chance of these two intersecting? That is, element, these are ordered pairs now. So, X intersection Y is empty. Now, I have two disjoint sets, both are of the same size, and of the given size M and N. So, now I can define mod X union Y, the size of this, as M plus N. Okay. Now, there is again the axiom of choice, that pick one element from A and then form all the ordered pairs with that as the first element. That axiom of choice will keep bothering you. It looks like, oh, what is the big deal about it? I pick. Okay. So, that's I will tell you what is the problem about that picking when we come to, that's actually, yes, okay, when we discuss axiom of choice, probably in the next class or the class after that. Okay. Now, this is the idea that is used. Given two sets with the cardinalities X and Y, the sum of these two is defined as the cardinality of the union of two disjoint sets with the same cardinality. Very clear? So, X plus Y is equal to cardinality of X union Y, where X intersection Y is equal to empty and X mod X equal to X, mod Y equal to Y. That such a thing can be constructed is what he said. Okay. Okay. Now that is where the problems with the infinity start. For example, I take x is countably, a is little x and little y both are countably infinite cardinalities, okay. So I choose a as m, I can choose b also as m, okay. Now how do I define the n plus n? These are cardinality of n plus cardinality of n. So I have to take a, and this b being n, I have to change it. What I will do is consider the ordered pairs 1 comma n, where n varies. So now I have disjoint sets. Now take the union of these two and then count. We will see shortly that if you add countably infinity to countably infinity, you are still countably infinity, just don't move, okay. And that sort of problems will start arising with infinity. 4 plus 5 will certainly be greater than 4 and greater than 5. But here, size of n, the size of n will be size of n. So, when Cantor said all this and said, we have a great madman with us, put him in lunatic asylum. They put him in lunatic asylum. He was almost treated like a madman, okay. That's because they didn't understand. They were mad, okay. So instead of they going to jail, they into a lunatic asylum, it will get crowded. So they put the intelligent fellow there, okay. There is a very famous book, okay, now nice time to end the story. There is a famous book by Chandrasekhar, not Chandrasekhar, I forgot the title of, is there in the physics department, anybody from the physics department? They don't think maths is necessary. Anyway, in the physics department several years ago, I found a book which was titled Random Walks in Science. Random Walks in Science, yes. Has anybody seen it? It's a beautiful book, it's a parody, and there is a very interesting article. It's called How to Catch a Lion in the Sahara Desert. Okay, and there are about 10 different methods given. Each one involves this idea from physics or mathematics or something, okay. And one of the proofs given is the following. Take a cage to Sahara Desert, you go and sit inside the cage and apply the inverse transformation. The lion is inside and you are outside. Okay. So what they did, they instead of putting, they went inside the lunatic asylum, they found it is crowded, they applied the inverse transformation, Cantor went into the asylum and they all came out, okay. So that's probably the tragedy of, it's an extraordinarily interesting book. It has about how to use electromagnetic theory to catch the lion, how to use relativity to catch the lion. There is another beautiful proof which we will be seeing in analysis very often, called the bisection method. Draw a north-south line in the Sahara Desert. So the lion is in one half. Draw now east-west half. Then it is in the 1/4. Go on dividing. The diameter becomes 0, and eventually catch the lion. Okay. So that's called the bisection method. Okay. So these are very useful methods, but he has a parody on all these things. Okay. So anyway, so we know how to define x plus y. How would you define x into y? Any idea? Ordered pair. That's you got to take Cartesian product. Okay. So you take the Cartesian product and look at the size of that. Define that the size of the Cartesian product to be the product of two cardinalities. If you have two cardinalities, get a set with that cardinality, get a set with that cardinality, take the Cartesian product, look at its size, that is defined to be the product of these two cardinalities. So that two are fairly easy, okay, that how would I define x to the power of y? This is very important, okay, and this is what I will start discussing in the next class, okay, and we'll have to go through a few things, and then we'll connect all those examples that we saw, 2 or 3 examples we saw about uncountable sets. Okay, I think it's the right time to stop.